From more news on the Epping Asylum hotels to political education in schools and the latest stats and trends like how the UK's climate could suffer as a result of its emissions. There's been loads of news this week and some of it you might have missed. Well, enter the roundup. Its purpose is simple. 1. We break down what's happened in UK political news, explaining it with all the nuance and facts left in. 2. I intend to give my impartial analysis on the big stories. 3. I try and do all of this in 20 minutes or less, and in a way which hopefully keeps you engaged. Now that's a lot for me to do, so I'd appreciate it if you gave me a like, a comment, or subscribed. Firstly, in news on policy change, the Independent cover calls for children to have lessons in how to vote at 16. Will they get lessons? What will the lessons contain? Let's look, shall we? Lessons in how to vote might be a bit of a crude way of saying students will receive political education. This comes from the Electoral Reform Commission and it will firstly come to those who are 14. But it should eventually be lowered to include children as young as 11. Now, as far as issues with indoctrination go, through teachers or teachers in just being biased, teachers will have to make it clear when their view is a personal one. The education will include discussion about wide-ranging political events and guidance on how teaching should be delivered, as well as key things about the UK's political mechanism, so how the House of Lords work or how the House of Commons operates. The executive of the Electoral Reform Commission, Vijay Ranjaran, has said that a lot of time is being spent in making these resources on impartiality, making sure teaching material isn't biased in any way. Now, the reason there's such a big focus on this is because there is a wide perception that educators and teachers are left-leaning, and also students at 14 or younger, even 11, are very, very impressionable, and so they can and they are very susceptible to bias in schools, at home, or online. It's worth noting, though, that this is all well and good coming from the Electoral Reform Commission, but it's the government that controls the curriculum. And so whether or not the Commission's work will actually inform the curriculum is less certain. It's essentially a regulator, and as a regulator, it has limited power over elections. Like I say, it has no power over the curriculum. The curriculum is the government's responsibility, and perhaps it will inform the government's teaching material it provides to schools, but it probably won't have a role in the actual implementation of political education in this country. That's especially because the government said that they're assessing the curriculum along the lines of the Independent Curriculum and Assessment Review, which is basically their review of what's wrong with the education system. Now, you can read its interim findings at the link that I'm going to flash up either side of me right now, but I'll go over them quickly. It's basically found the system isn't working for everyone equally. There are issues with teaching being outdated or the ineffectiveness of some subjects like languages in preparing you to speak or learn the language. Now, technology like AI and how it's being taught or used was also mentioned in their report. And there was the strength of vocational qualifications also mentioned. That means the interim report doesn't actually talk about political education at all. So that probably means it's going to come in the full report. But if it doesn't, the government's main review on what they're going to base political education off of, they say, that doesn't include political education at all. So it's a bit of a mismatch at the moment. We'll have to wait and see how it irons out. So swapping political education for changes to the House of Lords, ITV noted that peers could be forced to resign if they don't attend the Lords enough. Labour's manifesto pledged reforms to the House of Lords, like the introduction of a mandatory retirement age and the removal of hereditary peers, but one of their other stated manifesto goals was to include a participation requirement. Now, ITV said that this reform was hopeful and ministers hope to make it a reality. They say it's because the Select Committee scrutinises the legislation as it goes through the Commons and then in the Lords as well. These are bipartisan, they are made up of a representative of the Commons, but they have every party on it. The thing is, Labour have a huge majority. Even in these select committees, the proportion of them is stacked towards Labour. And also, scrutiny in the Lords is limited by convention, the Salisbury Convention, which limits how much scrutiny the Lords can apply to government bills, because these major government bills. And in this case, it's a policy stated in their manifesto. So if Labour want to do it, they will use their big majority to get the vote through the Commons, and then they will use the convention to get it through the laws, and it would be constitutionally unusual for this not to be the case. So, shifting focus slightly again, the Sun said they had an exclusive, and they said Labour could ban 16-year-olds buying alcohol-free beer while letting them vote. Obviously, that's referring to the lowering of voting age, which will happen by 2029. But the Sun quoted Health Minister Ashley Dalton, who said that the government will explore measures to regulate low and low alcohol beverages in line with other countries and international standards, which would include raising the upper limit for alcohol to 0.5% from 0.05. And that means that the alcohol in no and low alcohol beverages could be stronger. There could be more alcohol in those drinks. Now, the Sun put this in their article, but they didn't do anything with it. They just sort of left it there as a drifting paragraph and ignored it, basically. The next part they made quite a meal out of. It was in their headline. And it said that one of the regulations that could be made is banning 16-year-olds from buying the beverages. Well, when you add the context of the upping the limit to 0.5%, that sort of makes more sense. There's at least an explanation for it, and that's what the Sun was missing. Now, whether it's right or wrong is for you to decide, and I want you to let me know in the comments. But that's why I've covered this article, just to give you the context behind it if you've seen it and maybe been misled. From the Sun to the Mirror, that they suggested that criminals could face bans from pubs, concerts and sports events. So, what's this about? Well, I'll tell you, you're probably aware that bans can already be extended in these cases. Things like bans from football matches, bans from concerts, bans from certain areas under certain crimes. Well, the government has plans to expand sentencing powers to allow these bans to be applied to any crime, however unrelated it is to a sporting event or a certain area of a town. Now, the government is expanding these to basically act as a deterrent for people to commit crimes through fear they might lose access to their favourite sporting event, like a football match. They might not be able to support their team, or they might not be able to go to a concert they desperately want to go to. In theory, that's supposed to bring people into the community more, so it stops them from committing crime or deters them from committing crime. There are probably concerns over how wide the implementation will be, because any crime for any reason seems a bit much, but we'll probably see that in implementation. These changes are in line with their legislation on prisons and the community sentences, because they're trying to reduce the amount of reliance on prisons given the current overcrowding crisis that we've got in prisons in this country. So it all matches up. It's just basically how the implementation affects people, because what we don't really want to see is heavy punishments being handed down to very relatively minor crimes. So we at News of the Week will watch I at News of the Week will watch all of this legislation and see exactly how harsh it is on people. Stay tuned. Look at that flashy new transition. How was that? That was fun. Let's do it again. Oh, you saw it. I've had my film now, so we're going to sort of move on to foreign policy. And as Sky News covered, the Home Secretary agreeing a special biometric check for Gazan students. That seems the perfect place to start. Well, this is more complicated than it seems, because it seems like a good win for Gazan students, who can now, in theory, study at UK universities. There were around 80 given places this summer. We should probably start where this has all come from. And politicians, activists and others have fought for the 80 plus students that have been given places this summer to be able to study in the UK. They argued that these students' ability to take up their places was in danger of being dashed or threatened by the stringent biometric checks we have in place in this country. This is because the facility where we would check these biometrics, like pictures and fingerprint scans, that was closed in 2023 after the conflict started in the region, which makes it very, very hard to carry out these checks. Now, what's changed is that 40 or 50 of these students will be able to undergo these checks in a third country, assuming Israel allows them to. And that means that one of the barriers to this happening, to these 80 students coming over, has been removed. Now, there's still significant barriers over the practicality of getting people out of Gaza at the moment. It's very hard to get specific people out of a war zone, as you can imagine, especially people who may already be suffering from starvation or the impacts of war there. Another part of this which makes it more complicated is that Israel has to approve the evacuation of the student before they're evacuated. And that means that the dodgy diplomatic stuff that's been going on recently between Israel and the UK, with the UK's proposed recognition of Palestine as a state, could put the UK in a spot to bother diplomatically. That's what some suggest. Now, the two issues are unrelated, so it would be quite harsh of a foreign government to do that, but it has been known to happen before. Foreign governments, it's very tit for tat, you know? So we'll wait and see whether these students do get to come and study at the university places, but the likelihood is that it's been made easier by this change, which allows them to be processed in another country. Staying on the issue of Gaza, ITV News noted that the UK will allow extra aid in Gaza while Israel has stepped up its military action. So Israel has ended its daytime pauses in fighting, allowed aid delivery to Gaza on the basis that Hamas is still highly active and that the aid was being taken by them and misused. This was amid criticism that even those pauses weren't enough, that didn't allow enough aid and weren't managed properly to get aid into Gaza. Well, the Foreign Secretary David Lammy called for Israel to allow a surge in aid, pledging support for women and girls specifically, who he said are bearing the brunt of the conflict there and the suffering there. The UK has pledged £3 million through the UN's Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency, which will basically support midwives, and it's also working with charities like Oxfam to distribute hygiene products in Gaza. That concludes the news I got on foreign policy. Cue the new transition for general politics. Okay, in news on general politics, as you can tell, I'm going to update you all on a story from last week, which was about the Epping Asylum Hotel closure. Basically, last week I said both the Home Office and the owners of the hotel were going to appeal the injunction and try and get it overturned, so it could stay as a hotel which houses asylum seekers. Well, those appeals were heard this week, and the injunction has been lifted. Now, unfortunately, the details are limited, with the full written thing coming out on Monday. One thing being listed by Sky concerned the capacity of prisons in the judgment, and another thing being listed by the BBC was that it would have there was a concern about the effect it would have on protests, meaning that if people protested and disrupted enough, they'd get injunctions at hotels, which would then have a knock-on effect to capacity. But anyway, the government has responded by recommitting to their pledge to end asylum hotel use by 2029 and said that the ruling allows the government to do this in a planned and orderly fashion. Now, it's worth saying that this appeal can also be appealed and then go to a higher court, and it can be overturned as well. Also, other councils are still pressing ahead with legal action. Also, protesters remain there, and even though they're limited through police action, now the situation is still ongoing. So there's a lot of scope for things to keep happening and for it to appear in future episodes. So stay tuned for that. Now, The Guardian covered a story. Now, The Guardian covered a story from an MP who said she received death threats after a Tory MP shared a video on her position on the grooming gangs inquiry. So a Conservative MP, Robbie Moore, shared a video which said that another MP, was being misleading over her stance on the grooming gang inquiry, despite sitting on the grooming gang inquiry. Anna Dixon is the Labour MP in question who sits on the inquiry, and she was the target of the video, which basically said she'd always been against an inquiry, using her voting record as evidence. And now Dixon denies these claims, and she said she voted against the grooming gangs inquiries for other means, for example, the amendments to other legislation, which the legislation on it included. She published a statement saying she had received death threats and that these people had been reported to the police, and everyone was aware that it was coming directly from the video. Now, Moore condemned the death threats, but said the video raised legitimate concerns about her stance and her position on the inquiry. Who do you think's in the wrong here? Moving on to electoral fortunes, the Standard noted Labour has lost another by-election in London. Now, after losing around 7 by-elections in councils so far, since they took office in 2024, Labour lost another election, but in an area containing both Tulip Steek, the ex-security minister, and the Prime Minister Keir Starmer's constituencies. The Lib Dem candidate for the area won with 1,176 votes, which was more than double the Labour candidates, who had 400, and the order after that was Conservative, then Reform, then the Greens. What does this show? Well, it shows that there's discontent with Labour. I'm brutal, so do the polls. And it also shows that there's support for the Lib Dems as well. And again, so do the polls to some degree. But if we were to go off polls, you might assume that Reform might have won instead of the Lib Dems. So maybe it shows a regional difference between where Reform's support is and where the Lib Dems get their support from. That would certainly be backed up by other elections. The Lib Dems tend to do well in the southern constituency. Now, anyway, that includes the news I got on general politics. I'm going to move on to stats and trends now, not just because I get to do another flashy transition. As we move into the final section on stats and trends, the Eye noted that polling of voters says Yvette Cooper was right to ban Palestine action. And so polling by More in Common found that 43% of people back the move to ban Palestine action, with only 22% of people opposing it. That means almost double the amount of people that oppose the ban actually support the ban. I didn't get a number on how many were surveyed, so I don't know how representative this is of the wider population. I would assume it was in the few thousands, because that's generally what these polls are, but I don't know. There is also a deep unease about the consequences of the ban, so it's not like there's total outright support. 51% of people said they oppose the arrest of peaceful protesters, even if they express support of the group. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means that people broadly support the idea of the ban, but they don't necessarily support heavy-handed policing as a result. So there have been people being arrested because they have been holding signs which say Palestine action on them, because it's a prescribed terrorist group, and even that tacit support is seen as bad and it's seen as illegal because it's support for the terrorist group. It's giving them at least publicity. At worst, it's a member. At worst, that person is a member, so it's illegal. People don't necessarily support that part of it. They support the ban, but if people want to peacefully protest, they see that as okay, basically. Now, switching to support for bans to shoplifting, Sky News detailed that more than 80% of offences result in no charge. Sky News' analysis of the Commons Library showed that 289,464 cases of shoplifting were closed without a suspect last year. That is 55% of all cases. Now, only 18% of cases led to someone being charged, meaning 82% didn't lead to someone being charged. This comes as a big concern for the government's plan to reduce the amount of short sentences, like I covered earlier, and their new plan of community-based punishments not being seen as an effective deterrent by some. So what does that mean? It means that these numbers will be, the reason this has probably come out, and the reason that these numbers will be used and thrust into the spotlight a little bit, is because how much they change and what the current levels are show how hotly needed it is to maybe deter shoplifters, but also how successful the changes that are made are. So if in a few years' time we see that this goes down to 60 or 50%, there might be an argument that these changes that are going in now, the community-based punishments, were effective. If we see it rise further or just not change at all, it wouldn't be effective, and so all the time and money that's being spent would be well wasted. Well, the reason I've included it is it's a good marker to watch how this policy impacts the type of sentences and the type of offences that it's targeting, how the policy on prisons starts to act, basically. Now, going global with a climate change study, The Guardian noted that results have shown that a collapse of the critical Atlantic current is no longer a low likelihood. Now, you're probably asking what the current is and also what the significance was, because I was asking that a few hours ago when I was writing the script, and the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation Current is the current which brings warm water up to Europe and the UK. That has a large effect on our warm and temperate climate, which is geographically weird for us being where we are in the middle of the northern hemisphere. The change to that, no longer being a low likelihood, would be disrupted, meaning that we would be more like them. Our weather patterns would shift. Now that's the significance of the current and what it is. Now, what's going on with it is basically up till now, models have indicated that there is a low likelihood that it collapses, that current collapses before year 2100. But new analysis of models over a longer period of time show that the collapse could show in 2300 or 2500, with the tipping point for that happening and becoming inevitable starting in the next few decades. These reports say there will be a 70% likelihood of collapse if we stay as we are emissions-wise. If we lower emissions, it would be a 37% likelihood of collapse. And if there was no future emissions or very, very low future emissions, there would be 25% likelihood of collapse. The scientists behind these models noted that those numbers weren't certain because there was a small sample size, or basically that there aren't enough studies on it to confirm the results. They also cautioned that the risk was high despite this because of the negative effects of the current collapsing, i.e. drastic changes to the UK climate, for example. Anyway, that's the news I got this week. Thank you very much for bearing with me and listening. Now, if you want to see my sources where I got this stuff from, or maybe you want to see my script written down, you can on my website, newsoftheweek.net. Let me know what you thought in the comments below.